to be a world of conflict and competition. In the famous phrase, academic politics are so vicious because the stakes are so low. Professor X has never spoken to Professor Y for the last 20 years because Professor Y has 2 windows in his office and Professor X only has 1. That kind of story. And that there are powerful hierarchies with deans and heads of department at the top, junior lecturers wondering whether they're going to get tenure, a regular position, part-timers not sure whether they have a job next month, and of course right at the bottom, a pool of students. Vertical hierarchy. And all these kind of popular myths about the university are confirmed, validated by the media, by television programs about universities, novels about universities. You'll be surprised at how many detective stories take place in the halls of academe. Inspector Morse at Oxford, for example, C.P. Snow, murder in the senior common room is the kind of thing that we believe. And if you look at insider accounts, you also get something of this kind of impression. There is a book written by a professor of communication at the University of Colorado called Karen Stacy, and she studied events exactly like this one, where there was a visiting speaker and a bunch of students, a few staff, and so on. And in the discussion afterwards, she found that the discussion was dominated by the most senior academics in the room, as long as they were masculine. So that doesn't seem like very good news either. And George Lakoff, argument is war. We have to attack the other position and defend our own. And Deborah Tannen wrote a book called The Argument Culture, and she talks about the agonistic stance. Agonistic is quite a rare word. It's fighting. It comes from the ancient Greek, and the opposite of it, which is even rarer, is ludic, if you want that to know that too. And, oops, gone too far. So there is the abstract of an article by Deborah Tannen talking about university life. It's rather heavy going, but I'll just read it. The pervasiveness of agonism, that is ritualized adversitiveness in contemporary Western academic discourse, is a source of both obfuscation of knowledge and personal suffering. Framing academic discourse as a metaphorical battle leads to a variety of negative consequences, many of which have ethical as well as personal dimensions. And I remember Professor John Sinclair at the University of Birmingham speaking about linguistics colloquia, sort of ones like this, or this is not strictly linguistics colloquia, and what he called very nicely the tyranny of the counterexample. So what do you do if you go to a linguistics talk, and I've been to many of them, and the person puts forward a theory or an argument? You sit in your seat for the 40 minutes or so of the talk, trying to think up counterexamples to what the person has said. And if you find one counterexample, then that's done him in or done her in. So that's the tyranny of the counterexample. So, but I'm now going to look at academic speech as it really is, I think, and I'm going to use the Michigan corpus of academic spoken English that we put together at the end of the last century. We recorded about 200 hours, and that's 1.7 million words. It was an expensive project. It probably cost us, in the end, pretty well close to $500,000, because we had to go out and record, then we had to transcribe it using linguistics students, then we had to check it, and then I had to come along and talk to the speaker and make sure we got the proper names right and things like that. because we knew we were never going to get our money back on that. We knew that. So we argued, let's make it free to the world, which we did. And everybody ever since has been very happy with that, except perhaps for my dean, who might not have been quite so happy. So we were very interested in recording as many different kinds of speech events in the university as we could. We didn't just want to record lectures. And part of my thinking behind that one was a conversation with Michael McCarthy, who already had quite a lot of experience in putting together a corpus, and he said, don't forget to try and get at the more difficult stuff. So we had lectures, we had office hours, we had student presentations, we had 4 defences of PhDs. We would have liked to have more, but it was quite hard to get permission. Because the students said, well, I'm already going to be nervous, and if you're going to record it, I'm going to be doubly nervous, and so maybe not. We had research group meetings, we even had a campus tour, and we even went to the biological station in the university, 300 miles away, to record the academic speech that occurred on a boat while they were catching fish and examining the fish that they caught. We also tried to make it go horizontally across the university, as many different schools and colleges as we could. We got no recordings from the Faculty of Law, and the reason for that was very simple. All the professors of law refused to give us permission to record their lectures, being lawyers, and we didn't get enough from the business school, and that was our mistake. And I have to tell you, when you're designing a corpus, it's inevitable that you make one mistake. It's a recorded single-site study. So it's just at the University of Michigan. It's a recorded study, so you might want to ask questions about were there any microphone effects. Most of the recordings were audio, not video, like here. And there seem to be very few microphone effects, 1 or 2, and there's one here. You remind me sometime when we're not being taped, and I'll tell you a Feynman story about factors of 2 pi. So I'm afraid, ladies and gentlemen, you're never going to hear the story about the factors of 2 pi, to I'm sure your dismay and disappointment. It was recorded in the American Midwest, and there's some general feeling that speech in the American Midwest is a little slower, gentler, kinder than on the faster pace that we find in California and New York. I don't know of any real evidence for that. I have just one anecdote. While we were recording, or soon after recording, the provost of our university left. The provost is the number 2 person in the university. I think probably the deputy vice-chancellor. And there was a reception, and as I was director of the English Language Institute, I went to the reception, and she gave a speech. And one of the things that she said, when she came to us from Princeton University on the New Jersey, on the East Coast, she said, I had to learn when I came to Michigan, when the latest disaster struck, to say gee whiz rather than unfucking believable. Now, I don't actually think provosts, on the one hand, go around saying gee whiz and unfucking believable very much on the other, but you can understand something of what that might mean. So, if we start looking at the mic case data then. So, this is unscripted speech, and I think in some ways it's a great leveler, especially in comparison to academic writing. The levels of informality, there is relatively little difference between the speech of professors and the speech of students. So it's looking as though Professors maybe write differently from students, and maybe listen a bit differently, read a bit differently, but maybe they don't speak so differently. Consider, we might think of 3 forms of prefacing meta-discourse before you say what it is you want to say. You might say, if you want to be pretty formal, the issue I wish to address is. The issue I wish to address is. Or if more neutrally, you might say, the point I want to make is. Or being informal, the thing I want to say is. Okay? You see those differences there. It turns out that the only people who say that are graduate students when they're talking about their research projects. Professors tend to say the last one. We have a PhD defense in musicology recorded. It consists of 4 full professors at the university and, in fact, a doctoral student from Germany. And they're talking about Jarrett. The topic is Jarrett, the jazz pianist. You might expect this to be a very formal event. But in fact, it's one of the events when the use of thing, the thing I want to say, the discussive thing, is the most frequent. It's full of professors saying, oh, 2 other things before I pass it on. First, oh, I forgot that thing I wanted to say. You know, it's full of that. It's very thingy as a speech event. Now, we know across the university, from one building to another, from one department to another, there are huge differences. There are huge differences in epistemology and methodology. There are huge differences at the speed of which things change and so on. But if you look at it purely verbally, the differences are much diminished, I would argue. So if we look at the way people are being talked about, we get things like this. We get things like Bellow in 1990 did a concept analysis, nursing, chemistry, did an experiment, somebody in math did 82%. And you might ask yourself, well, what's all this doing? What's all this dids? Because we're never going to write anything like that. And I think it's because, and most of these come from lectures, it's because the lecturer trying perhaps vainly to persuade his or her students or student audience that academics do more than just say things and write things, they actually do things. If we look at the top 4 people who are cited in my case, they are Marx, Darwin, Einstein and Kant. I'm afraid they're all men. When the project is replicated in 85 years, there'll be lots of women. But now, then, it was Marx, Darwin, Einstein, and Kant. And when people are talking about Marx, how do they do it? They say Marx claims, Marx calls, Marx says, Marx points out. You know, you might be talking to your greengrocer or something and discussing what's happening or around. So-and-so pointed out and say, I mean, do look at the do's. So it looks very informal, right? And that one always likes me like that, because what people do is they put words in dead philosophers' mouths. So Kant's going to want to argue that parking meters are a good idea because they distribute income from the richer to the poor. So Kant's going to want to argue that, although of course Kant died in 1840 or when he died. And there's lots of present tense. So Marx chooses to call it the bourgeoisie, to make it more alive. Marx isn't just under a stone on Hampstead Heath. Across the university there are lots and lots of visuals going on, right? Tree diagrams in linguistics, slides of pictures in fine art, graphs in many fields, cross-sections in architecture, in geology. The visuals pretty well everywhere, except perhaps in philosophy or something. But they talk about them all the same way. Oops, pretty well. They talk about them all the same way. So this is some of the doing the searches on the left. And it looks as though that there's a little mini grammar of deictics to talk about what's on the screen. So, up there on the left, you can see this. And down here on the right, and note that we'll see what we've got here. I mean, it's a little mini language that sorts that out. And it travels from one part of the university to the other. I'm going to attempt to read this. So this is two well-known professors sharing a colloquium like this, an interdisciplinary colloquium in, I think, natural sciences. And just listen to the language that is used. What we plan to do here is I'll talk for a little bit to them about sort of the underlying framework that we think we're operating under here, and then when I finish that, that'll be just 5 minutes or so. Then I'll talk about the work we're doing in Nicaragua. Why Yvette will talk about the work we're doing in Mexico. And finally, when we finish this, I'll come back up here to talk a little bit more reflective about how the theoretical framework fits into the work we're doing and what we plan to do in the future and how other people might be wanting to join us. Okay? Whew, right. That's one utterance. And if you wanted to diagram that, do a tree diagram of that, you'd be there for months and months and months, right? And I'll get on to the difference between speech and writing at the moment. But what I want to point out is how informal that language is. It's not about the issues that we plan this afternoon to report on our latest research investigations. No, it's not all that pompous stuff. And it's very repetitive. Same things. Talk a little bit, it occurs all the time. Lots of hedging, and when anything a bit posh turns up, like underlying framework, sort of the underlying framework. So it's a remarkable piece. And why is this happening? It's because I think in the kind of demotic culture of the American Midwest, the speaker is trying to come down off the podium and narrow the distance between him or her and the audience. To build a little bit of rapport by talking about what your car is broken down, you take it to the garage, and the garage guy says, well, what we plan to do here is that we're going to sort of do this, and you know, I mean, it could be that conversation style. Michael Halliday. Speech is grammatically intricate, but lexically sparse. Lexical is vocabulary. So if you look back, back, so, right? Grammatically intricate, very complicated grammatically, that utterance, but lexically sparse, repeating itself, limiting. Complexity, Halliday, complexity of speech is choreographic. You kind of dance from one part of your utterance to the next part. Not entirely sure which move you're going to the left or the right, but you're keeping moving in that kind of way. So that's what he says. Okay. Conclusions so far. The lecturer with the lesson plan. We've done 20 minutes, so I better give you a summation. I've got 20 minutes here. More linguistic homogeneity across disciplines, greater employment of visuals, more signposting and reflexive meta-discourse. What we're going to talk about, lots of those pseudo-cleft structures, differently hedged, sorta, kinda, a little bit, not conceivably. It seems to me it might possibly happen that, but sorta, kinda, a little bit. Informal, thing I want to say. Consensual rather than critical. We don't, wherever Deborah Tannen went, it wasn't to the my case corpus to try and see what was happening. Praise is direct, criticism is mitigating. So that's great. That might be a little bit unfair. It's, the questions that you don't really want are why questions. Of the possible why questions, the ones that are second worst are why with the past tense. Why did you do that? And the really worst ones are those ones but in the negative. Why didn't you? Quote me in your latest paper. Right? So, and there aren't many. It's quite hard to find why didn't you questions, where you put the person on the spot. And you can see mitigation of power inequality. And the key role of humour. Humour, there is an episode of laughter every 3.5 minutes in our 4 PhD defences. Humour is the lubricating oil that gets you over sticky moments. So, when we started the My Case project, we had 2 kind of foundational questions, or maybe 3. Is academic speech more like academic prose or more like ordinary conversation? Do academics Gibson speak more like a book or more like a chap in the bar? And it's quite clear, we should have known the answer. We should have known the answer, at least in the Anglophone world, that it was going to be more like conversation. Very colloquial, with a certain amount of technical vocabulary as I've been using in this talk with you this afternoon. Then there's a more difficult question. Is academic speech, does it require a different grammar? Or 2 grammars of English, like there are 2 grammars of Arabic for colloquial Arabic and formal and classical Arabic. According to the Longman grammar, you don't. But if you took an applied perspective, if you were designing teaching materials for international students, you might want to think about that a little bit more differently. Although, I don't know where that's going now. Okay. Well, all right. Yes. So let's just see. Let's just quickly remind ourselves about academic prose. Nearly all declarative sentences. A few questions, a few interrogatives when people are talking about research questions. Almost no exclamations. Just 1 or 2 occasionally in philosophy when they're feeling after their 3rd drink. The average length is about 25 words a sentence. That always seems to be the norm to which everything approximates. It's complex clause structures are complex noun phrases. A lot of the vocabulary comes from Greco-Latin based via French and Italian and so on. And there's a basic subject-verb-object, subject-verb complement. That's the basic structure of the sentence. Actually, I think I'm going to leave that because we don't need it today. So let's have a look at the SVO pattern. This is the traditional tree structure of generative syntax with your S and your MP and your VP surrounded by white paper. It's an interesting metaphor, that white paper. So, what happens if we have repeating or missing SVO elements? These have various names. I'm going to call them pre and post dislocations. Some people call them heads and tails and things. So there's the standard sentence. The next test is going to be tough. We can also say, though we cannot write, the next test. The next test, it's going to be tough. You ready for it? Where we've got subject 1 and subject 2. It's kind of like those languages that have a topic, comment, structure. Topic, the next test, comment, it's going to be tough. Right. Oh, but it can go at the other end too. It's going to be tough, the next test. Do that. You can't write it. Well, you can in fiction, but you shouldn't in your thesis. So these dislocations, where we've got doubling ups, they're about 7 per 10,000 words. So that's 7 in each lecture. I'm not sure if I've used one today yet, but we might listen and see if I have one. So here's some examples. It should be fairly simple, the lab exam. Chemistry, does that count as a natural science? The Big Dipper, it's standing on its tail, right? Those things. Now what is interesting about them is that they're very unevenly distributed. You get 30 minutes of talk, and then suddenly you find 3 or 4 in the next minute or 2. And why is that? It's because they occur at trouble spots. Well, they tend to occur at trouble spots. When something is not being clear, everybody's looking very puzzled about what the person is saying, things of that kind. So it's to clarify the theme, or to break a structure into pieces, or to add information that you suddenly think people are missing and they need to know. That's one aspect. Now, what about the SVO when there is no subject? Now, you're not supposed to do that in English. English is not a so-called prodrop language like Spanish or Italian. It's supposed to have a subject so that people could understand what the verb is doing, because there's no verb or not enough verb morphology. But we find them quite commonly. I think 17% of all occurrences of depends in the my case corpus don't have any subject. Perhaps you use that too, right? What time will you arrive? Depends on the bus. We don't need to put the it in there. Right? Gotta go. Sounds okay. Turns out, I first was interested in this because I had a doctoral student, a Chinese doctoral student in dentistry came to see me, and she said, can I show you the PowerPoint slides for the presentation at the conference that I'm going to? I said, sure. And she put the slide up, and then she said, looks kind of busy. I don't think my international students do that very often, drop the subject in that natural way. I thought, oh, that would be something to think about. So that's how I got into that a little bit. How am I doing for time? I think this is perhaps not very interesting. So we'll go away, we'll make that one go away. It's just further example. Oh, now this, now this, now this. So, main and subordinate clauses. We'll taught that in high school. Main and subordinate clauses. The main clause carries the main idea. True? Do you believe that? Were you taught that? Put the main idea in the main clause and put whatever else you're putting in the subordinate. Right? Sensible advice. You're going to be an English teacher. Yeah, you're going to. Right. And we have some famous linguists who support this view. I know she left. I know main clause, she left subordinate clause. I know she left designates the process of knowing, not leaving. Langaker, right? Our leading cognitive linguist. He should know. Surely he should know. Now consider that. We have 3 sentences there, ladies and gentlemen. If you are right, the first sentence is about knowing, the second sentence is about thinking, and the third sentence is about guessing. No? No. No, it's not, is it? This is the important bit, right? And what you're doing with that is just talking about the strength of your belief about the fact. Right? So, of course, it might be. You could, a witness in law court could say, I know she left because I saw her driving away. I mean, you can think of circumstances when Langaker is right, but most of the circumstances that further away, we can turn that round. Well, we can mostly turn it round. We say, she left, I guess. Right? She left, I think. I'm not sure quite why you can't say she left, I know, but I don't think you can. What's your sense? What's your sense? She left, I know. Is that possible? It's less. The other two are fine, aren't they? The other two are fine. Yeah, but the third one, I don't know why. It may be something to do with the cognitive commitment of knowing. And here is the great Sandy Thompson, my favourite linguist. Just retired. From Santa Barbara. He puts it better than I could. Okay. Yes. So, if you want to make a suggestion at the University of Michigan, you don't use the verb suggest. You don't say, I suggest, Professor Swales, you stop talking in 5 minutes. Right. You use the verb suggest to report suggestions. My advisor suggested that I transfer to another university. We used to report suggestions. So, how do we make a suggestion? It depends on how onerous the suggestion is. If it's a very easy suggestion to comply with, you say one thing. If it's a bit more difficult, or you're imposing a little bit more, then it's something else. Anybody like to tell me what's going to come up next? How about? That's very interesting. We do have some how abouts, but they're not that common. I suspect it's more British than American. We have that. Why don't you grab a chair? Why don't you, for simple suggestions? Now then, what are you going to say for the trickier ones? Pardon? Would you mind? Yes, that's close, but it's too formal.
Maybe we should.
Maybe we should. Yeah, that's close, but it's not quite informal enough. See, this is what. So if you're in the state of Michigan, this is what you do. You might want to do all the homework. And this amazing one. This is, I think, a teacher of writing in the composition program. And I think it's a nervous doctoral student just starting out. And she says, you might just want to, like, again, sort of draw out some of the conclusions from this a little bit. How hedged can you get? That. Okay. Wiersbecker, the Australian, Polish-Australian semanticist, talks about interactional query formulae. Now, when we want to check whether people are understanding what we're saying, we often just say something like, okay, right, yeah, those kinds of things. But you can say something longer. And the two most common formulae for Wiersbecker from the British National Corpus was, you know what I mean? And you see what I mean. Right? So, I read an article. It's always good to read an article every now and again. And she talked about the Cobiel, the Birmingham corpus. And I said, yes, that's right, we have those in my case, but also we have something else, which is equally common. You know what I'm saying? You see what I'm saying? You don't use that in Yorkshire? You don't use that? No, well, I thought originally it was a class difference. The more educated person said, you know what I mean, and the less educated person said, you know what I'm saying. But it didn't turn out. That was yet another of my hypotheses that burned and crashed. What I'm interested about me is Wiersbecker, and she knows much more about this than I do, said these longer formulae are more common in English than in other languages, and she knows lots of languages. She says they're increasing over the last 100 years. She says that, I don't know whether that's true. Careful and measured expressions of opinion and exchange of view. I've been staying with my cousin the last day. Careful expression and measured expressions of view. Maybe, maybe not. Don't know. And we also have another one, which one I think you may use too. Does that make sense? Or you can, drop the subject. Make sense? That makes sense?
Yes.
You can drop things. And I think this is very idiolectal. I think that each individual often has their preferred forms, the ones that they use. I think the one I use is typically, does that make sense? I had a colleague in Africa many years ago, a British colleague, who always used to say, "Do you get my drift?" And when he wasn't there, we always referred to him as the drifter. Right, messing getting on here. Right, we don't need that. Okay, they're stored as chunks. You know what I mean? You know what I say? I mean, that's in the brain as a piece that you trot out. And you notice the intonation. You know what I mean? You make that negative. You don't know what I mean? The intonation entirely changes to one of surprise and indignation and so on. And they're not used very much by non-natives. The attitudinal past that occurs only in speech. So you're called to see a very important person in the university as soon as possible. So you put your head around the door of that person, and you have two options. You could say, "Do you want to see me?" or "Did you want to see me?" And I suspect in that circumstance, you're more likely to choose that one. Because it's more deferential, it's less imposing, it adds distance. Yeah? It's nothing to do with time. Nothing to do with, "Did you want to see me yesterday?" "Sorry, I forgot." No. In my case usage, we can see that of these attitudinal pasts, because this is in the present, I have a question, and then it becomes in the past, in order to be nice and kind. I was just curious. I've just been at a conference in Nottingham, and most of the questions were used the attitudinal past. I was just wondering rather than I am wondering. Right. So, I was just wondering, the was is twice as common as the present tense. All right, we had an undergrad who looked at when it was will and when it was ul, when it was contraction. It depended partly on the age of the speaker. The older the speaker, the more wills and the fewer uls, and it was also dependent on the interactivity of the speech event. Speech events like student study groups where everybody's talking at once, there were lots of them. In formal lectures there were less, but that wasn't the real reason. It depends what your subject is. And if the subject is common, to most circumstances it's more likely. I know you're writing this down. We can leave the slides if anybody wants to. You've got the slides on the... Yeah, so you don't have to scribble those numbers down because you can get them when you want. So you can see these are huge percentage of ill. When we get a rare word like polymerase, have I got that right? Yes, that's right. 4 and 2 things. This one is very interesting because it's so hard to say. People will, it's because it ends in an L, so people will a bit hard to say. So these are kind of little projects that anybody can do, and lots of people use the MyCase corpus to do these projects from around the world. No time for this, sorry. To finish up, more thoughts on what? More homogeneous than academic speech, at least as represented by the MyCase corpus, is more homogeneous than academic writing. It's demotic. It's not very genre specific, it's more register specific. So we're not finding the differences between dissertation defenses and lectures and tutorials that we might originally have expected to find. It's consensual rather than critical. People are nice, rather than nasty. Argument is not necessarily war. Humour, respect and hedging are prime lubricants, potentially sticky moments. We're looking towards a fragment on the one hand and a phrase grammar of English. We have lots of multi-word units. We have fragments, things like remember, that jumps around a sentence. They're not sentences. I used to remember when. No, it's not like that, is it? We did that last week, remember? Part of these fragments come from something that Stephen Levinson wrote. Inference is cheap, but articulation is expensive. Articulation is expensive in two ways. It's physically expensive. Here I am having a drink of water, been speaking to you. And it's also cognitively more demanding on you. It's harder to speak than to listen. It puts more of a strain on you. So I'm going to finish with Ludwig Wittgenstein to show that I learned something in my undergraduate days as a philosophy major. And this is taken from his philosophical investigations. Perhaps the most important book written in philosophy in the last 70 or 80 years. And this comes from the famous language game between one bricklayer and another. And one bricklayer says to another, slab, and the other bricklayer passes him a slab. So, and Wittgenstein argues that the meaning of a word is its use, not what it points to. Right? So far so good, everybody agrees on that. Now, what's the relationship, Wittgenstein says, between slab and bring me a slab? Now, all those of you who are trained linguistically will know that most people believe that slab is a shortened version of bring me a slab. Lots of deletions have taken place. And Wittgenstein says something very interesting. I don't know whether it's right, but it's very interesting. But why should I not, on the contrary, have called the utterance bring me a slab a lengthening of the utterance slab? And if you're into sort of radical pragmatics, that's the way you might think. That the normal thing is to say slab, but when you've got an apprentice bricklayer, a new person, or there's a high wind, or the person is a bit deaf, when the communication channel is not as smooth as possible, you lengthen it to say, bring me a slab. Stephen Levinson says, inference is cheap, but articulation is expensive. Thank you very much.